America bet on FIFA. Now, economists are raising red flags. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is being sold as an economic jackpot. Billions of dollars in spending, millions of visitors, thousands of jobs. And according to some projections, one of the biggest economic opportunities in modern American history. At least that's the story. But what if that story isn't entirely true? What if the biggest sporting event on earth isn't the economic goldmine people think it is? And what if the biggest winner of the 2026 World Cup isn't America at all? Because as the tournament gets closer, economists are starting to ask some uncomfortable questions. Questions about the numbers, questions about the projections, and perhaps most importantly, questions about who actually profits when the World Cup comes to town. Tonight, we're going to follow the money. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the economic impact of the World Cup is far more complicated than most people realize. Let's start with the promise. Back in 2018, FIFA officially awarded the 2026 World Cup to a joint bid from the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Immediately, headlines started appearing everywhere. The biggest World Cup ever. 48 teams, 104 matches, millions of international visitors, billions in economic activity. For politicians, city officials, and business leaders, it sounded like a dream scenario. Think about it. Millions of football fans flying in from around the world, booking flights, booking hotels, eating in restaurants, taking taxis, buying merchandise, attending matches, spending money everywhere they go. It's easy to see why so many people got excited. In theory, the World Cup should create a massive wave of spending. And according to various projections, that's exactly what's expected to happen. But here's where things get interesting. Economists don't just ask how much money will be spent. They ask a completely different question. How much of that money is actually new? And that question changes everything. Let's imagine you're a football fan from Germany. You've always wanted to visit New York. In fact, you've been planning the trip for years. Then the World Cup gets announced. Instead of visiting in October, you decide to visit during the tournament. You spend $5,000. You stay in hotels. You eat in restaurants. You buy tickets. From the outside, it looks like the World Cup generated $5,000 in economic activity. But did it? Not really, because that money would have entered the economy anyway. The timing changed. The spending didn't. Economists call this the substitution effect. And it's one of the biggest reasons why mega sporting events often fail to deliver the economic miracles that politicians promise. The money moves around, but it doesn't necessarily create new wealth. And once you understand that concept, many of the enormous World Cup projections start to look a little different. But that's just the beginning, because there's another issue that often gets overlooked. Imagine you're planning a family vacation. You want to visit Miami, or Los Angeles, or New York. Then you discover that the World Cup is happening. Hotel prices have doubled. Restaurants are fully booked. Traffic is a nightmare. The city is packed with tourists. What do? For many travelers, the answer is simple. You postpone the trip, or you go somewhere else. Economists call this crowding out, and it's surprisingly important because while World Cup fans are arriving, other tourists may be staying away, which means some of the spending that appears to be new is actually replacing spending that would have happened anyway. It's one of the reasons why economists often look at headline economic projections with skepticism. Those projections tend to focus on what comes in, but they don't always account for what disappears. And when researchers go back years later to study the actual impact of major sporting events, the results are often far less dramatic than the original forecasts. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear. This doesn't mean the World Cup won't generate money. It absolutely will. Hotels will benefit, restaurants will benefit, airlines will benefit, bars will benefit, retail businesses will benefit. For many companies, the summer of 2026 could be one of the most profitable periods they've ever experienced. The question isn't whether there will be economic activity. The question is whether that activity creates the kind of long-term economic transformation that people are expecting, because those are two very different things. And that's where the conversation gets really interesting. To understand why we need to talk about FIFA. Because whenever people discuss the economic impact of the World Cup, they usually focus on host cities: Dallas, Miami, Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York. but they rarely talk about the organization sitting at the center of everything, FIFA, and that's a mistake because FIFA isn't just organizing the tournament, FIFA is operating one of the most profitable sporting businesses on the planet. Think about where the real money comes from: broadcast rights, global sponsorship agreements, commercial partnerships, licensing deals, official merchandise, hospitality packages, advertising. These revenue streams generate billions of dollars, and a significant portion of that money flows directly to FIFA, not to host cities, not to local taxpayers, not even to local businesses. To FIFA, which creates a fascinating dynamic. The host cities provide the venues, the transportation systems, the security operations, the emergency services, the logistical support, but FIFA controls some of the most valuable revenue streams. And that raises an obvious question. If America is taking on much of the responsibility, who is taking home most of the reward? Now, supporters of the World Cup would argue that this criticism misses the bigger picture. And to be fair, they have a point, because not every benefit can be measured immediately. There are intangible benefits too: global exposure, international tourism, marketing, city branding, business investment opportunities, the chance to showcase America to billions of viewers around the world. These things have value, and in some cases, significant value. The problem is that they're incredibly difficult to measure. How do you calculate the value of someone deciding to visit New York 3 years later because they watched a World Cup match on television? How do you measure the long-term branding impact for a city like Dallas or Miami? You can't, at least not precisely, which means that both supporters and critics often end up arguing with incomplete information. And that's one reason the debate never seems to go away. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because unlike many previous World Cup hosts, America enters this tournament with one enormous advantage: infrastructure. Think about countries like Qatar, or Brazil, or South Africa. Many of those nations spent billions building new stadiums, roads, transportation systems, and supporting infrastructure. Some projects were successful. Others became famous examples of what economists call white elephants: massive investments with very little long-term use, stadiums that sit largely empty after the event, facilities that generate little return. The United States faces far less of that risk. Most of the stadiums already exist. Most of the airports already exist. Most of the hotels already exist. Most of the transportation networks already exist. That's a huge difference. And it dramatically changes the economic equation. Instead of spending tens of billions building new infrastructure, America can largely focus on maximizing existing assets. That alone makes the 2026 World Cup economically safer than many previous tournaments. But safer doesn't automatically mean transformative. And that's where another problem emerges: scale. The American economy is enormous. We're talking about an economy worth nearly $30 trillion. To put that into perspective, many countries would consider $1 billion transformational. For the United States, it's barely noticeable at the national level. Even if the World Cup generates billions in economic activity, those numbers become surprisingly small when compared to the size of the overall economy. It's like pouring a bucket of water into the ocean. The water matters, but the ocean barely notices. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding major sporting events. People often assume that because an event is globally significant, it must also be economically transformative. But those aren't the same thing. The World Cup can be the biggest sporting event on Earth and still have a relatively modest impact on a $30 trillion economy. Both things can be true at the same time. And then there's another factor that almost nobody talks about: timing. Because the economic impact of the World Cup doesn't exist in a vacuum. It arrives during whatever economic conditions happen to exist in 2026. If consumer confidence is strong, spending may surge. If travel demand is high, hotels may thrive. If businesses are investing aggressively, the benefits could be amplified. But if economic growth slows, if consumers pull back spending, if international travel weakens, then the impact of the tournament may be far less impressive than expected. In other words, the success of the World Cup isn't determined entirely by football. It's also determined by the broader economy surrounding it, and that's something no organizer can fully control. So where does all of this leave us? Was hosting the World Cup a mistake? Probably not. Will America benefit? Almost certainly. Will businesses make money? Without question. Will millions of fans create a surge in economic activity? Absolutely. But those answers don't fully address the concerns economists are raising. Because the real debate isn't about whether benefits exist. The real debate is about scale. How big are those benefits? Who receives them? How long do they last? And are they worth the costs? Those questions are much harder to answer, and they're also far more important. Because ultimately, the World Cup is a gamble, not a reckless gamble, not necessarily a bad gamble, but a gamble nonetheless. America is betting that hosting the biggest World Cup in history will create opportunities, growth, investment, and international attention. FIFA is betting that expanding the tournament will generate record-breaking revenues. Businesses are betting on millions of customers. Cities are betting on tourism. Airlines are betting on travelers. Hotels are betting on visitors. Everyone is making a bet. The only question is whether those bets pay off. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the answer is rarely as simple as the headlines suggest. Because when the tournament finally arrives, the stadiums will be full. The television audiences will be enormous. The excitement will be unforgettable. But when the crowds leave, when the cameras shut off, and when the final whistle blows, that's when the real economic story begins. That's when we'll find out whether the promises matched reality, whether the projections were accurate, whether the benefits lasted, and whether America's bet on FIFA was truly worth it. Until then, economists will keep asking questions. And the red flags they've raised aren't about football, they're about money. And as we've learned time and time again, when billions of dollars are involved, following the money usually tells the most interesting story of all.